Was the pact with the devil signed in invisible ink? In the summer of 1933, a document was finalized that sent a shockwave through the world, yet its most damning clause, a secret addendum discussed in hushed tones, has never been found in any archive. It remains a ghost on paper, a whisper in the dusty corridors of history. That same summer, just days before the German parliament was to grant Adolf Hitler absolute power, the leader of Germany's powerful Catholic Centre Party, Prelate Ludwig Kaas, a man who held the deciding votes, met with the future Pope. He emerged from the meeting a changed man, his resistance broken. Soon after, he was exiled, and his party, the last democratic bastion against the Nazis, was dissolved. He died years later in Rome, taking the secrets of that conversation to his grave. What was said in that room? What promises were made? What threats were uttered that could dissolve a century of Catholic political power in a single afternoon? This is not a story about good versus evil. It is a far more terrifying story about what happens when an ancient institution, built on the promise of eternity, decides to make a deal with a power that promises a 1,000-year empire. The Weimar Republic was dying. It was a death rattle heard in the jackboots of stormtroopers marching through Berlin, in the shattering glass of Jewish shops, in the desperate, fevered speeches at smoke-filled rallies. Germany was a nation on its knees, starved by depression, humiliated by defeat, and hungry for a savior or a scapegoat. It found both in one man. For the Vatican, watching from its marble halls in Rome, the chaos was a terrifying spectacle. But the brown-shirted thugs were not the primary fear. The true enemy, the great Satan of the 20th century, was Bolshevism. The spectre of atheistic communism pouring out of Russia promised the utter annihilation of the church, the closure of schools, the murder of priests, the end of faith itself. Compared to this existential threat, the vulgar, strutting Austrian corporal seemed to some like a manageable problem. A barbarian, perhaps, but a barbarian who spoke of order, of family, of national pride. A barbarian who might just be the lesser of two evils. The Reich built concentration camps, the Vatican built cathedrals, but both feared the same thing, Bolshevism, and this fear proved stronger than any faith. The architect of the Vatican's response was a man of exquisite subtlety and profound ambition, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli. The Holy See's top diplomat, a man who had served as nuncio in Germany for over a decade, Pacelli was no stranger to the German soul. He was an aristocrat of the spirit, a tall, ascetic figure with piercing eyes who moved with an unnerving grace. He spoke fluent German, loved German culture, but despised the messy, unpredictable nature of parliamentary democracy. He believed in order, in authority, in clear lines of command. He saw in Hitler not a messiah, but a tool. A crude, violent tool, certainly, but one that could be used to hammer German Catholicism into a unified, disciplined bloc, and more importantly, to erect a bulwark against the red tide from the east. Pacelli's worldview was forged in the rigid hierarchy of the Church. He understood power not as a dialogue, but as a decree from above. For him, a treaty with a dictator was infinitely preferable to negotiating with 100 squabbling politicians. The negotiations began in secret, a shadow play conducted in quiet Roman apartments and back rooms of Berlin ministries. Hitler's representative was the bumbling but sly vice-chancellor, Franz von Papen, a Catholic nobleman who believed he could control the Nazi beast. Pacelli, from Rome, pulled the strings. The prize was a Reichskonkordat, a formal treaty between the Holy See and the German Reich. For Hitler, it was a staggering diplomatic coup. It would be his first major international agreement, a stamp of legitimacy from one of the oldest moral authorities on earth. It would signal to the world and to his own wavering Catholic population that the new regime was a respectable partner, not a gang of thugs. It would neutralize Catholic political opposition overnight, demanding that bishops and priests swear an oath of loyalty to the Reich. It would effectively muzzle the German Church, trading its political voice for the guaranteed protection of its schools, its youth groups, its right to collect taxes. For Pacelli, the deal was a pragmatic masterpiece, a shield to protect the Church in what he knew would be a stormy future. He was sacrificing the political power of the German Church to save its spiritual soul. The Concordat, signed in July of 1933, was celebrated by both sides with champagne and solemn pronouncements. Papen boasted that he had secured a truce between the swastika and the cross. The Vatican newspaper praised Hitler's statesmanship. But even as the ink was drying, the stormtroopers were kicking down the doors of Catholic youth clubs. Priests who had been critical of the regime were being arrested and sent to the newly opened camp at Dachau. Catholic newspapers were being shut down. The Nazis had interpreted the Concordat not as a treaty between equals, but as a surrender document. They had their prize, the moral and political capitulation of the German Church. Now the promises they made to get it were worthless. The speed of the betrayal was breathtaking. The Concordat explicitly guaranteed the existence of Catholic organizations. Within weeks, those very organizations were being forcibly dissolved and absorbed into the Hitler Youth. It promised freedom for the Catholic press. Within months, it was silenced. The treaty was a firewall that turned out to be made of paper, and the Nazis had brought a flamethrower. Protests from German bishops were ignored. Diplomatic notes from the Vatican were filed away, unanswered. Hitler, having received the Vatican's blessing, now had no further use for its approval. He had played Pacelli perfectly, preying on his fear of communism and his desire for centralized authority. The Cardinal, a master of the diplomatic game, had been outplayed by a street-brawling ideologue. He had sought to build a fortress to protect the Church, but had instead handed the keys to the enemy. The human cost of this grand diplomatic maneuver was immediate and brutal. Erich Klausner, the head of the Catholic Action Group, a man who had fiercely opposed any deal with the Nazis, was shot in his office during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. His death was officially ruled a suicide. Adalbert Probst, the national director of a Catholic youth sports association, was taken into the woods and shot. His name was on the same list. The message was clear: the protections of the Concordat were a fiction. Anyone who dared to use the Church as a platform for opposition would be eliminated. The German bishops, bound by their new oath of loyalty and ordered by Rome to avoid conflict, fell into a bewildered silence. They had been told this deal would save them. Now they were watching their bravest shepherds being led to the slaughter, and their hands were tied. The question echoes through the decades: was it a cynical betrayal or a catastrophic miscalculation? Did Pacelli and Pope Pius XI genuinely believe they could tame Hitler with a treaty? Or did they see the writing on the wall and choose what they believed was the only path to institutional survival? Perhaps the most chilling interpretation is that they understood the danger perfectly. They saw the violence, the paganism, the contempt for human life, but they saw it as a temporary storm that had to be weathered. The Church, after all, thinks in centuries. Empires rise and fall, ideologies burn themselves out, but the institution remains. The survival of the Church itself, the vessel of salvation, was the ultimate priority, outweighing the fate of any single generation. This cold, long-term calculus would come to define the Vatican's posture for the next 12 years. The Concordat was more than a political agreement. It was a moral transaction. It set a precedent for how the Holy See would deal with the monstrous reality of the Third Reich. It established a pattern of public accommodation and private, ineffectual complaint. It taught Hitler that the Church's moral outrage could be bought for the price of institutional guarantees he had no intention of honoring, and it placed the master diplomat who engineered the deal, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, on a trajectory that would lead him directly to the throne of St. Peter, just as the world was about to plunge into the abyss. He had made a deal to avoid a war with the state, but he was about to inherit a war for the soul of mankind. He would soon have to weigh the cost of his signature not in broken promises, but in millions of human lives. This deal, this pact, was it a desperate attempt to save the faithful from a godless evil? Or was it a cold, calculated move on the grand chessboard of power? What do you think was the primary motive? Let us know in the comments below. Was it fear of communism, or was it a cynical power play? The story is just beginning, and the choices only get harder from here. The man who signed the Concordat, Eugenio Pacelli, would soon wear the white robes of the papacy, his name and his conscience forever bound to the fate of a world at war. His silence would become louder than any scream, a silence that still echoes from the darkest chapter of human history, a silence that many believe was the final terrible price of this unholy alliance. The world held its breath in March of 1939. As German tanks prepared to roll into what remained of Czechoslovakia, the white smoke of the Sistine Chapel announced the election of a new pope. The cardinals had chosen the one man whose entire career had been a preparation for this moment, Eugenio Pacelli. He took the name Pius XII. The seasoned diplomat, the architect of the Reichskonkordat, was now the shepherd of 1 billion Catholics on the precipice of the deadliest conflict in human history. He was a man who prized negotiation over confrontation, prudence over passion. His critics would call it cowardice, his defenders would call it wisdom. But as the continent descended into a charnel house, his defining characteristic would be one that no one expected from the Vicar of Christ, a profound, deafening, and seemingly endless silence. Did he not know, or did he not care? The truth, buried in the Vatican's archives for decades, is far more complicated and far more troubling. From the moment the war began, the Vatican became one of the best listening posts in the world. Its network of priests, nuns, and bishops stretched into every corner of occupied Europe. The reports that began to flow into the Apostolic Palace were not battlefield dispatches, but something far more sinister. They were eyewitness accounts of mass executions in Poland. They were desperate letters from Jewish leaders in Slovakia begging for intervention. They were coded messages from nuncios in Vichy, France, describing the roundups of families, the packed cattle cars heading east. Pius XII read these reports. We know this from his own handwritten notes in the margins, notes that express anguish, horror, and a recurring, paralyzing sense of helplessness. The Pope knew. The question that has haunted his legacy is not what he knew, but why he did little with that knowledge. The debate raged within the Vatican walls, a secret war of conscience fought in hushed Latin. On one side were cardinals like the Frenchman Eugene Tisserand, who urged the Pope to issue a thunderous encyclical, a clear and unambiguous condemnation of the Nazi genocide by name. To remain silent, Tisserand argued, was to become complicit. He warned that history would not forgive such a failure of moral leadership. On the other side was the powerful curial machine, the diplomats and bureaucrats who surrounded the Pope, men who echoed his own cautious instincts. They argued that a public denunciation would be a futile gesture. It would not stop Hitler. It would only unleash his full fury upon the Catholics of Europe. Hitler, they reminded the Pope, had contingency plans drawn up for the invasion of the Vatican and the arrest of the pontiff himself. A fiery encyclical, they cautioned, could lead to the destruction of the Church in Germany and Poland and the deaths of millions of the faithful. This was the Pope's terrible calculus, the lives of the innocent who were already being murdered versus the potential lives of millions more who might be murdered if he spoke. He chose the path of diplomacy, of quiet intervention. Behind the scenes, the Vatican diplomatic corps worked feverishly. They issued thousands of end-user certificates for war materials, allowing Jewish organizations in America to purchase and ship supplies. They issued false baptismal certificates and Vatican passports. Monasteries and convents across Italy, on direct orders from local bishops, opened their doors to hide thousands of Jews and political refugees. In Rome itself, when the Nazis occupied the city in 1943, churches and Vatican properties became sanctuaries. It is estimated that the Roman Catholic Church, through this silent network, saved hundreds of thousands of Jewish lives, far more than any other international organization. It was a vast, clandestine rescue operation conducted in the shadows while the Pope maintained his public neutrality. But can quiet, heroic actions absolve a leader of his public moral responsibility? This is the crux of the debate. For every life saved in a Roman convent, thousands more were being extinguished every day in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. And from the throne of St. Peter, there came no clear condemnation. There were allusions, vague pronouncements of sympathy for the victims of war and racial persecution, but the words Nazi and Jew were never spoken. The Pope's most famous wartime Christmas address in 1942 spoke of the hundreds of thousands who, solely because of their nation or race, have been condemned to death or progressive extinction. The Allies heard it as a condemnation of the Nazi atrocities. The Nazis, hearing their specific crimes unnamed, largely ignored it. The victims, waiting for a clear beacon of hope, a voice to name their suffering, heard only a whisper. It was a message so delicately coded that it became meaningless, a diplomatic pirouette performed on the edge of a mass grave. The frustration was palpable among Allied diplomats. The British envoy to the Holy See repeatedly pleaded with the Vatican to speak out, to use its immense moral authority to galvanize opposition to Hitler. He was consistently rebuffed. The Pope's defenders argue he had no divisions, no armies. His only weapon was his voice, and to use it would be to risk everything for a gesture that would change nothing on the ground. But his critics counter that moral authority is precisely the weapon to be used when all others have failed. A clear denunciation from the Pope might not have stopped the panzer divisions, but it could have sent a powerful message to the millions of Catholics in Germany and across occupied Europe. It could have told them that cooperating with this regime, driving its trains, staffing its camps was a mortal sin. It might have inspired more resistance, more acts of individual conscience. Instead, the message from the top was one of caution, of obedience to legitimate authority, however monstrous. The case of Slovakia is a particularly damning example. The head of the Nazi puppet state was Monsignor Józef Tiso, a Catholic priest. When his government began deporting its Jewish population to the death camps, the Vatican protested, but privately, through diplomatic channels. Tiso, a priest, was sending tens of thousands of people to their deaths. The Pope had the power to excommunicate him, to publicly denounce him as a heretic and a murderer. He never did. The private protests were ignored, and the deportations continued. The fear of destabilizing an Allied Catholic regime and perhaps pushing it closer to Berlin outweighed the moral imperative to condemn a priest who was actively participating in the Holocaust. The institution, once again, was protecting itself, even at the cost of its soul. The weight of this knowledge, the daily litany of horrors, took a visible toll on Pius XII. He became even more gaunt, more ethereal. He spent long hours in prayer, his aides describing him as a man tormented. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, a prisoner of the very prudence and diplomacy that had defined his entire life. He had spent his career navigating the treacherous currents of European politics, always seeking the middle ground, the negotiated settlement. But he was now faced with an absolute evil, an evil that did not negotiate, that could not be appeased. His lifelong skill set was utterly useless in the face of the crematoria. He was a master chess player in a world where his opponent had thrown the board into the fire. This image of the tormented, isolated pontiff is central to his defense. He was not a cold, unfeeling anti-Semite, his supporters argue. He was a deeply spiritual man faced with an impossible choice, who chose the path he believed would save the most lives, even if it meant sacrificing his own reputation. He chose to work in the dark, to be a silent savior rather than a martyred prophet. But the nagging question remains. What if he had chosen differently? What if he had stood in St. Peter's Square and named the evil for what it was, risking his life, his office, and the security of his church for one great, defiant roar of conscience? We will never know. But the silence he left behind created a moral vacuum, one that has been filled with anger, with suspicion, and with a debate that continues to rage. The shepherd had watched the wolves devour his flock and had chosen to pray for them in silence, hoping the wolves would not notice him. The immense cost of running his clandestine rescue networks and maintaining the Vatican's precarious neutrality required a constant, secret flow of funds, managed by an institution as opaque as the Pope's own heart, the Vatican Bank. At the heart of the Vatican is an institution shrouded in more secrecy than the Holy Office of the Inquisition. It has no public ledgers, no board of shareholders, and until recently was accountable to no one but the Pope himself. It is officially known as the Institute for the Works of Religion, but the world knows it as the Vatican Bank. During the war, this financial fortress became a crucial instrument of papal policy, a silent engine funding everything from clandestine rescue operations to the Vatican's vast diplomatic network. But a darker accusation has haunted the bank for decades, that in its quiet, sanctified vaults, the gold of the Holy See became inextricably mixed with the blood gold of the Third Reich. It is a story of high finance and low morals, a financial detective story where the suspects wear cassocks and the crimes are buried under layers of piety and denial. The wartime operations of the Vatican Bank are a black box, the records are sealed, and the institution has consistently met all inquiries with a wall of impenetrable silence. But from declassified Allied intelligence documents, post-war lawsuits, and the dogged work of investigative journalists, a disturbing picture emerges. The Vatican, as a neutral state, was one of the few entities that could freely move money and assets across warring borders. This unique position made it an attractive partner for all sides, including the Nazis. The central allegation is that the bank became a laundromat for Nazi assets, helping the regime convert plundered wealth into hard currency needed to finance its war machine. This wasn't just state gold, but the most personal and horrific kind of loot: dental gold, wedding rings and other valuables stripped from the bodies of millions of victims of the Holocaust. The trail often leads to the Nazi puppet state of Croatia, the Ustaše regime. After committing genocide on an industrial scale, the Ustaše leaders plundered the wealth of their victims, Serbs, Jews, and Roma. As the war turned against them, they began smuggling this treasure trove, estimated to be worth tens of millions of dollars, out of the country. The route, according to numerous testimonies and intelligence reports, led straight to Rome. Eyewitnesses described convoys of trucks arriving at the Vatican, unloading heavy crates under the cover of darkness. The Ustaše leaders, fleeing the Allied advance, found refuge in Roman monasteries protected by sympathetic clergy. The treasure, it is alleged, found its way into the vaults of the Vatican Bank to be laundered, invested, and used to finance the post-war escape of Ustaše war criminals. The key figures in this shadowy world were not just bankers but priests with an aptitude for finance. Men like Bernardino Nogara, the brilliant layman who ran the Vatican's finances for decades, a man who believed the Church's financial independence was paramount to its spiritual mission. He invested in everything from munitions factories to pharmaceutical companies that collaborated with the Nazis. For Nogara, the moral provenance of the money was secondary to the return on investment. His job was to make the Holy See rich, to ensure it would never again be at the mercy of outside political powers. If that meant dealing with Mussolini's fascists or Hitler's bankers, it was a price he was willing to pay. This was not personal greed, it was a form of institutional fanaticism where the financial security of the Church justified any means. After the war, the accusations began to surface. A declassified United States Treasury Department report from 1946, written by Agent Emerson Bigelow, explicitly stated that Ustaše treasure was being held in the Vatican. The report was buried for decades. Survivors and their descendants filed lawsuits, attempting to force the Vatican to open its books. They were met with claims of sovereign immunity and outright denials. The Vatican has consistently maintained that its wartime financial activities were entirely proper, focused on humanitarian aid and the protection of church assets. It dismisses the allegations of laundering Nazi gold as baseless anti-Catholic propaganda, the stuff of conspiracy theories. But the questions refuse to go away primarily because the Vatican refuses to provide the one thing that could settle them: a full, transparent audit of its wartime accounts. The logic of the alleged transactions is chillingly pragmatic. The Vatican needed money to fund its operations. The Nazis and their allies had money, albeit stolen and blood-soaked, that they needed to hide and launder. It was a marriage of convenience, a transaction conducted in the moral grey zone created by the chaos of war. The Vatican could tell itself it was using tainted money for a good cause, saving lives, protecting the Church. The Nazis could use the Church's unimpeachable reputation as a cloak for their financial crimes. Everyone, in a way, got what they wanted. The victims, of course, were not consulted. The gold torn from their teeth may well have paid for the food that fed the refugees hiding in a Roman convent, a perfect, hellish circle of wartime morality. This financial entanglement helps explain the Vatican's reluctance to confront the Nazi regime directly. A public condemnation of Hitler would not only have endangered Catholics in Europe, it would have jeopardized the complex financial relationships that kept the Holy See afloat. Was the Pope's silence partly bought? Not in a crude, direct sense, but in the subtle, corrosive way that financial dependence always works. The Church had become a shareholder in the European order, an order now dominated by the Third Reich. To radically challenge that order was to risk not just political reprisal, but financial ruin. The Bank of God, in its quest for security, had inadvertently become a partner with the financiers of genocide. The story does not end with the fall of Berlin. The money, now cleansed and legitimized, became the seed capital for the Vatican's post-war financial empire. And it may have been used for one final terrible service to the architects of the fallen Reich. The money that flowed into the Vatican's coffers was not the only thing that needed to be moved secretly across borders. As Allied prosecutors began preparing for the Nuremberg trials, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of the most wanted men in the world were converging on Rome. They were not seeking spiritual solace. They were seeking a ticket to a new life. The financial channels that had allegedly laundered their gold were now being repurposed to help the criminals themselves disappear. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, but for some, a new war was just beginning. A war of escape and evasion. As the victorious Allies began the monumental task of hunting down the architects of the Holocaust, a secret network of escape routes began to form, a web of clandestine paths leading from the ruins of the Third Reich to safe havens in South America and the Middle East. These routes became known as the ratlines. And at the heart of this web, in the eternal city of Rome, sat a handful of priests and even a bishop who saw it as their sacred duty to help some of the most monstrous mass murderers in human history vanish without a trace. This was not a policy of the Vatican as a whole, but the work of a few well-placed individuals whose actions would forever stain the Church's reputation. The central figure in this post-war noir thriller was Bishop Alois Hudal, the rector of the German National College in Rome, Santa Maria dell'Anima. Hudal was an Austrian, a fervent anti-communist, and a man who, even after the horrors of the camps were revealed, saw Nazism as a flawed but necessary defense against the greater evil of Bolshevism. He believed the Allied war crimes trials were little more than victor's justice. In his memoirs, he would brazenly write that he considered it a charitable act to help these so-called political refugees escape. Using his position and his connections within the Vatican, Hudal transformed his college into a clearinghouse for fugitive Nazis. He provided them with shelter, money, and most importantly, the false identity papers that were the key to freedom. The process was chillingly simple. A fugitive Nazi, often a member of the SS, would arrive in Rome with the help of a network of sympathetic monasteries in the Alps. They would be hidden in Franciscan or Dominican houses, their SS uniforms swapped for monks' robes. Hudal or his assistants would then procure a new identity card from the Vatican's Refugee Commission, a document that carried immense weight with Allied authorities. With this new identity, they could then obtain a visa from a country like Argentina or Paraguay, nations ruled by sympathetic dictators who were happy to welcome experienced anti-communists. The final step was a ticket on a ship sailing from Genoa. Hundreds, including men like Adolf Eichmann, the logistical mastermind of the final solution, and Josef Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, passed through this network to safety. Why did they do it? The motives of Hudal and his collaborators were a toxic mixture of ideology naivete, and fear. The primary driver was a panicked, all-consuming anti-communism. With the Iron Curtain descending across Europe, they saw the Soviet Union as the new satanic empire. They believed that a war between the West and the Soviets was inevitable and imminent. In this coming crusade, experienced German soldiers, even former SS officers, would be needed. Saving these men was not just an act of mercy, they reasoned, but a strategic necessity. They were saving skilled warriors for the next holy war. This twisted logic allowed them to overlook the fact that these soldiers had spent the previous 5 years murdering women and children. There was also a misguided sense of charity. Some priests genuinely believed these men were repentant, or that they were simply soldiers who had been following orders. They heard their confessions, offered them absolution, and then helped them escape earthly justice. It was a perversion of the concept of mercy, a confusion of spiritual forgiveness with a get-out-of-jail-free card. For these priests, the law of God trumped the law of man, and if they believed a man's soul was saved, his crimes on earth were a secondary matter. This spiritual arrogance had deadly consequences, allowing men who should have been in the dock at Nuremberg to live out their days in peaceful sunshine. Did Pope Pius XII know about the ratlines? This is one of the most hotly debated questions. There is no direct evidence, no smoking gun document, that proves he explicitly ordered or approved of Hudal's operation. His defenders argue that Hudal was acting on his own, a rogue bishop abusing his position. They point out that the Vatican itself was a chaotic place after the war, flooded with millions of genuine refugees, and it was easy for criminals to slip through the cracks. But it is difficult to believe that an operation of this scale, run by a prominent bishop in the heart of Rome, could have gone completely unnoticed by the Vatican's highly efficient intelligence service. It seems more likely that the Pope's attitude was one of willful blindness. He may not have approved, but he did not intervene to stop it. Hudal was, after all, fighting the communist enemy. The ratlines were the final sordid chapter of the unholy alliance. The same institution that had negotiated the Concordat, that had maintained a public silence during the genocide, now saw some of its members actively helping the perpetrators escape justice. It was the ultimate betrayal of the victims. The Church had failed to speak for them in their hour of need, and now it was helping their murderers. The network was not just for Germans, it was also the primary escape route for the leaders of the most fanatically brutal of all the Nazi puppet regimes, a regime whose leaders were not just fascists, but also devout Catholics. Their hands were drenched in the blood of hundreds of thousands, and their escape route led directly through the Vatican. The moral choices of history are never simple. Faced with the rise of a genocidal regime, some within the Church chose to aid the escape of its architects, believing they were fighting a greater evil. Was this a justifiable act in the face of the Cold War, or an unforgivable betrayal of justice? Let us know what you believe guided their hand. Comment with justice if you think they should have faced trial no matter what, or strategy if you believe their anti-communist fears were a valid reason. The path these executioners took from Rome often led them to new lives, but their crimes originated in a particular corner of hell on earth, a place where Franciscan monks became mass murderers, the independent state of Croatia. There are chapters of the Second World War so monstrous they seem to defy comprehension. The story of the independent state of Croatia is one of them. Forged in 1941 after the Nazi invasion of Yugoslavia, it was a puppet state in theory, but in practice, it was something far more terrifying. A self-proclaimed Catholic theocracy built on a foundation of genocide. Its leaders, the Ustasi, were not just fascists, they were clerical fascists, a movement that fused extreme Croatian nationalism with a militant, fanatical version of Catholicism. Their goal was to create a racially pure Croatia, which meant the systematic extermination of the nation's Orthodox Serbs, Jews, and Roma. The Vatican's relationship with this regime is perhaps the most suppressed and blood-soaked chapter of its wartime history. The leader of this state was Ante Pavelic, a man whose brutality shocked even his German patrons. The spiritual guide of the movement was Archbishop Aloysius Stepinac of Zagreb, the head of the Catholic Church in Croatia. Stepinak's role remains a subject of furious debate. His defenders, including the Vatican, which has beatified him, portray him as a saint who privately worked to save victims while trying to pastor his flock under a brutal occupation. His critics accuse him of being an enthusiastic collaborator, a man who gave the regime its moral legitimacy, who blessed its leader, and who turned a blind eye to the atrocities being committed in the name of the Catholic faith. The truth is a murky, horrifying landscape of complicity and compromise. The Ustase unleashed a campaign of terror that was unique in its sadistic, hands-on cruelty. This was not the industrialized, bureaucratic killing of Auschwitz. This was intimate, personal slaughter, often carried out with knives, hammers, and saws in villages and churches. Entire Serb communities would be rounded up, given the choice of forced conversion to Catholicism or immediate death. Many who converted were killed anyway. The symbol of this horror was the Jasenovac complex, not a single camp, but a network of death camps along the Sava River. It was the Auschwitz of the Balkans, a place of unimaginable suffering, run not by Germans, but by the Croatian Ustase. And here, the story takes its darkest turn. A significant number of the commandant's guards and executioners at Jasenovac and other camps were Franciscan monks. Driven by a blend of religious zeal and nationalist hatred, they became some of the most feared killers in the regime. The most infamous was Miroslav Filipovic, a Franciscan who became the commandant of Jasenovac. Known as Fra Sotona, or Brother Devil, he personally participated in the torture and murder of prisoners, his monk's robe spattered with blood. He was not an anomaly. Dozens of priests took up arms, led death squads, and justified the slaughter from the pulpit as a holy crusade against the enemies of Christ and Croatia. They were the ultimate expression of the unholy alliance, the cross in one hand, the knife in the other. Archbishop Stepanak knew what was happening. Priests from his own archdiocese wrote to him, detailing the massacres, begging him to intervene. He did protest to Pavelic, but always privately, his letters complaining about the improper methods of the killings, not the fact of the killings themselves. Publicly, he continued to appear at state functions, to praise the Ustase state as a creation of God, and to order his clergy to pray for its leader. He never publicly condemned the genocide. He never threatened to excommunicate the Catholic murderers. His priority, like that of Pius XII in Rome, was the preservation of the institutional church in the new Croatian state. The price of that preservation was silence in the face of a Holocaust being carried out by his own flock, sometimes by his own priests. As the war ended and the Ustase regime collapsed, its leaders fled, carrying with them the plundered wealth of their victims, gold, jewels, and art worth a fortune. This became known as the Ustase treasure. As we have seen, the trail of this treasure leads directly to Rome. The same priests and monks who had blessed the Ustase state now used their clerical networks to help its leaders escape along the ratlines. Ante Pavelic himself was hidden in a Roman monastery under the protection of the Vatican before escaping to Argentina. The treasure, it is widely believed, was deposited in the Vatican Bank, a bloody down payment to ensure the Church's help. The stolen gold of the victims was used to buy the freedom of their murderers. The post-war Vatican actively worked to cover up its role and to protect figures like Stepanak. He was tried for war crimes by Tito's new communist government in Yugoslavia, a trial the Vatican denounced as a communist show trial. He was convicted, but his story was rewritten in the West as one of heroic anti-communist martyrdom. The story of the Franciscan killers, of the forced conversions, of the Jasenovac death camp was largely forgotten, a historical footnote too inconvenient for the tidy narratives of the Cold War. It was a successful campaign of historical revisionism, but the facts remain, buried in archives and in the memories of the survivors. The Croatian chapter reveals the alliance at its most raw and explicit. Here, the Church was not a silent partner, but in many ways an active participant, providing the ideological justification for genocide. It showed how easily religious faith could be twisted into a murderous ideology, how the call to love thy neighbor could be replaced by a call to cleanse the nation of the impure. It was a crusade, but not against a distant enemy. It was a crusade against neighbors, a holy war fought in small villages with the most primitive of weapons. While this brutal, overt war was raging in the Balkans, a different kind of war, a secret war of shadows and whispers, was being fought on the very doorstep of the Pope in the supposedly neutral streets of the Eternal City itself. During the Second World War, the city of Rome was officially an open city, a neutral space ostensibly safe from the ravages of combat. In reality, it was a boiling cauldron of espionage, the most contested piece of real estate in the secret war. The tiny sovereign state of the Vatican, nestled within its heart, was the ultimate prize. It was a kingdom of whispers, a global listening post, and a perfect stage for the deadliest spy games of the 20th century. Allied agents, Gestapo officers, and the Holy See's own secretive intelligence service waged a relentless, invisible war in the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica. Priests became spies, nuns became couriers, and the ancient catacombs beneath the city became hiding places in a real-life thriller where the stakes were not just secret information, but thousands of human lives. The Vatican was the perfect playground for spies. As a neutral state, diplomats from all the warring nations could operate there legally. An American envoy could have coffee at a cafe just tables away from the German ambassador. This created an atmosphere of intense paranoia and opportunity. Every priest with foreign contacts, every monsignor with a diplomatic pouch, was a potential asset or a potential threat. The Vatican's own intelligence service, a shadowy entity sometimes called the Holy Alliance, or the Entity, was one of the most effective in the world. Its information gathered not through high-tech gadgets, but from the confessional boxes and bishops' palaces of a global network. When the Nazis occupied Rome in 1943 after the fall of Mussolini, the game turned deadly. The Gestapo, under the command of the ruthless SS Colonel Herbert Kappler, began a reign of terror. Their main objective was to crush the Italian resistance and round up the city's Jewish population. Their main obstacle was a surprisingly effective underground network run from within the Vatican itself. The leader of this network was an unlikely hero, an Irish priest named Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty. Tall, gregarious, and seemingly unafraid of anything, O'Flaherty used his diplomatic immunity and his wits to create a massive escape line for downed Allied airmen, escaped prisoners of war, and Italian Jews. O'Flaherty's operation was a masterpiece of clandestine improvisation. He turned apartments, monasteries, and even Vatican offices into safe houses. He built a network of ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, nuns, aristocrats, and communists who were all united in their hatred of the Nazis. O'Flaherty himself would often disguise himself as a coalman or a street sweeper to move around the city, meeting his contacts right under the noses of the Gestapo. He was the Scarlet Pimpernel of the Vatican, a ghost who seemed to be everywhere at once. A white line was painted on the pavement at the entrance to St. Peter's Square, marking the border between Vatican territory and occupied Italy. O'Flaherty would often stand on the Vatican side, taunting Kappler's men who stood just feet away, powerless to touch him. The personal duel between the Irish priest and the Nazi colonel became the stuff of legend. Kappler knew O'Flaherty was his chief adversary. He had the priest's network infiltrated, his agents arrested and tortured, but he could never get to the man himself. He put a price on O'Flaherty's head and gave his men orders to shoot him on sight if he ever stepped over that white line into Italian territory. The Gestapo even planned a raid to kidnap him from within the Vatican itself, a plan that was only narrowly averted. The Pope, Pius XII, was aware of O'Flaherty's activities. While he never gave his official blessing, he allowed them to continue turning a blind eye to the blatant violation of Vatican neutrality that was happening under his own windows. It was part of his dual strategy: public silence, private action. O'Flaherty was the living embodiment of that private action, saving an estimated 6,500 people from Kappler's grasp. But the spies were not all heroic. The Vatican was also crawling with double agents, informants, and collaborators. Priests with pro-fascist sympathies fed information to the Gestapo. The Germans had their own deep-cover agents within the Holy See's bureaucracy. No one knew who to trust. A coded message could be a lifeline or a death trap. A friendly conversation with a fellow clergyman could be a genuine exchange or an interrogation. The paranoia was corrosive, turning the Holy City into a maze of mirrors where every face wore a mask. Hitler himself became obsessed with the Vatican's influence. He saw it as a nest of spies and anti-Nazi intrigue, a nest of vipers. At one point, he became so enraged that he ordered General Karl Wolff, the SS commander in Italy, to draw up plans for Operation Rabat. The invasion of the Vatican, the seizure of its archives and treasures, and the abduction of Pope Pius XII, who was to be taken to Germany as a prisoner. Wolff, a pragmatic and cunning officer, knew such an action would be a military and public relations catastrophe. He slow-walked the order, delaying and prevaricating until the Führer's attention moved elsewhere. The plan was never carried out, but it reveals the extent to which the Vatican was seen not as a spiritual entity, but as a strategic enemy by the Third Reich. The secret war in Rome was a microcosm of the larger moral conflict. It was a story of incredible courage and chilling betrayal, of high-minded ideals and dirty, back-alley compromises. It demonstrated that even within the supposedly monolithic institution of the Church, there was a spectrum of response, from heroic resistance to active collaboration. For every Hugh O'Flaherty, there was a Bishop Houdal. The Vatican was not a single actor, but a stage on which individuals played out their own dramas of conscience. But this war was not only fought with hidden radios and false passports, it was also an ideological war, a battle for the minds and souls of Europe, a battle that was fought in art galleries and university lecture halls, a crusade against ideas themselves. In the summer of 1937, 2 art exhibitions opened in the city of Munich. They were held just across the street from each other, but they represented 2 opposing universes. One was the Great German Art Exhibition, a state-sponsored celebration of the Nazi ideal, heroic, classical, and racially pure art. It was filled with paintings of stoic soldiers, fertile peasant women, and idealized landscapes. It was sterile, bombastic, and deeply boring. Across the street, housed in a cramped and poorly lit building, was the exhibition that drew all the crowds. It was called the Entartete Kunst exhibition, the Degenerate Art exhibition. It was a deliberately chaotic and insulting display of the greatest works of modern art, a public shaming of everything the Nazis despised. This ideological war on culture was not a Nazi invention. It had deep roots, and in the Vatican's own centuries-long practice of censorship, the Nazis found a powerful precedent. The Degenerate Art exhibition was a masterstroke of propaganda. Works by Picasso, Kandinsky, Klee, and other modern masters were hung askew, surrounded by derogatory slogans and the scribbled insults of asylum inmates, suggesting that these artists were mentally ill. The message was clear: modern art was a symptom of a diseased Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy to undermine the healthy German spirit. It was foreign, intellectual, and abstract, everything the Nazi cult of blood and soil rejected. Millions of Germans flocked to see it, to mock it, and to have their prejudices confirmed. For the Nazis, controlling art was not about aesthetics, it was about controlling the narrative, controlling thought itself. Anything that encouraged individualism, ambiguity, or critical thinking was a threat to the totalitarian state. This impulse to control and suppress dangerous ideas was something the Vatican understood perfectly. For 400 years, the Holy See had maintained the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the index of forbidden books. It was a list of thousands of books, works of science, philosophy, and literature that Catholics were forbidden to read under pain of mortal sin. From Galileo's defense of the solar system to the novels of Victor Hugo, the Index was the ultimate tool of intellectual censorship, an attempt to build a doctrinal wall around the minds of the faithful. The methods were different. The Nazis burned books, the Vatican banned them, But the underlying principle was the same, the belief that certain ideas are so dangerous they must be eradicated for the good of society and the salvation of the soul. The Nazis confiscated over 16,000 works of degenerate art from German museums. Many were sold abroad to raise foreign currency. Thousands more were publicly burned in a Berlin courtyard in 1939, a bonfire of cultural treasures. But what happened to the rest? This question opens one of the great art detective stories of the 20th century. Many of the most valuable pieces disappeared into the private collections of top Nazis like Hermann Göring, but persistent rumors and some circumstantial evidence suggest another destination for some of these plundered masterpieces. The trail leads through the neutral art markets of Switzerland and, according to some researchers, into the secret vaults of the Vatican itself. The theory is that as the war progressed, some Nazi officials looking to secure their post-war futures sought to trade stolen art for favors or safe passage. The Vatican, with its international network and its opaque financial system, would have been an ideal partner. There is no definitive proof of this, no bill of sale for a Picasso signed by a cardinal. The Vatican vehemently denies ever having acquired stolen art, but the secrecy of the Vatican's collections is legendary. Beyond the public museums, there are vast, inaccessible archives and storerooms. What masterpieces or what evidence might lie hidden there is a matter of intense speculation. The post-war hunt for these missing works became a global obsession, with teams of Allied monuments men scouring Europe for hidden caches of art. This parallel crusade against degeneracy highlights the ideological overlap between the two powers. Both Nazism and the Catholic Church of that era were deeply conservative authoritarian institutions. Both were hostile to modernism, liberalism, and intellectual freedom. Both believed in a single, absolute truth and the need to protect their followers from corrupting influences. This shared worldview created a space for mutual understanding, even as they despised each other on other grounds. They were rivals for the soul of Europe, but they were fighting the same enemies: secularism, communism, and the chaotic freedom of the modern mind. The battle over art was not a sideshow to the war, it was central to it. It was a battle over who had the right to define reality, to shape the human imagination. For the Nazis, art was a tool for creating their new Aryan man. For the Church, art was a tool for illustrating the divine order. For the modern artists, art was an expression of individual freedom and subjective truth. It was this last idea that both the Reich and the Vatican found so intolerable. The war against degenerate art was a war against the freedom of the human spirit, and this shared ideological ground, this common enemy, might explain one of the most secret and daring political maneuvers of the entire war, a moment when the Pope himself became a conspirator. What would it take for a Pope to become an accomplice in a plot to assassinate a head of state? The answer came in the brutal winter of 1939. While the world watched the new, terrifying efficiency of the German blitzkrieg in Poland, a small group of men within the German High Command came to a desperate conclusion. Adolf Hitler had to be eliminated. They were not moral crusaders or champions of democracy. They were conservative German patriots, high-ranking military officers and civil servants who believed Hitler was leading their beloved country into a suicidal, unwinnable war that would end in its utter destruction. This was the German resistance, and their only hope for success lay in securing a secret channel to their enemies in London, a channel that ran directly through the office of Pope Pius XII. The conspirators were a circle of elites, men like Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the enigmatic head of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, and Colonel Hans Oster, his fiercely anti-Nazi deputy. They knew that simply killing Hitler was not enough. The regime would survive and the war would continue. They had to overthrow the entire Nazi government, but to do that they needed assurances from the British that if they succeeded, Germany would be offered a just peace, not a punitive surrender like the Treaty of Versailles. Without such a promise, they could never win the support of the German army. But how could they, officials of a government at war with Britain, make contact? Any direct approach would be seen as a trick. They needed an intermediary of unimpeachable integrity. There was only one man on earth who fit that description: the Pope. The key go-between was Joseph Müller, a devout Catholic lawyer from Munich with connections to both the conspirators and the Vatican. In a series of cloak-and-dagger meetings that could have come straight from a spy novel, Müller travelled to Rome and, through the Pope's private secretary, made contact with Pius XII. The Pope was faced with a momentous and terrifying decision. To act as an intermediary for the plotters was a staggering risk. It was a blatant violation of the Vatican's neutrality. If he were discovered, Hitler would have the perfect pretext to unleash a savage persecution of the Church throughout the Reich. It could mean the arrest of bishops, the closure of churches, even the invasion of the Vatican itself. The Pope would be seen as a traitor by many German Catholics, and yet he agreed. Pius XII, the man of caution and diplomacy, the architect of the pragmatic Concordat, chose to become an active participant in the plot to kill the German dictator. He listened to the plotters' plans, he took their messages, and through his own trusted channels, he passed them on to the British envoy to the Holy See, Sir Darcy Osborne. It was an act of extraordinary courage. The Pope was risking his office, his church, and his life on the conviction that removing Hitler was the only way to save Europe from total catastrophe. For a brief, tense period, the fate of the world hung on this secret chain of communication that ran from a lawyer in Munich through the Apostolic Palace in Rome to the Foreign Office in London. The negotiations were fraught with peril and mistrust. The British, led by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and his Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax, were deeply sceptical. Was this a genuine plot or an elaborate German intelligence trap designed to sow division among the Allies? They demanded proof. Who were the generals involved? What were their specific plans? The conspirators, fearing a leak, were reluctant to reveal too much. The Pope found himself in the middle, trying to bridge the gap, vouching for the sincerity of the German resistance while urging the British to take the risk. He was no longer a neutral arbiter, he was a co-conspirator, emotionally and morally invested in the plot's success. Ultimately, the plot failed. The British government remained too hesitant to offer the firm guarantees the German generals needed. Then, in May of 1940, Hitler launched his stunningly successful invasion of France and the Low Countries. The swift, decisive victory made him a hero in the eyes of the German people and the military. The window of opportunity for a coup slammed shut. The generals who had been plotting against him just weeks before were now scrambling to receive medals from him. The conspiracy collapsed. The Pope's secret channel fell silent. Joseph Müller was eventually arrested by the Gestapo and spent the rest of the war in concentration camps, but he never betrayed the Pope's involvement. This forgotten episode casts the legacy of Pius XII in a completely new light. The man so often condemned for his public silence was, in this instance, a man of decisive, courageous, and highly dangerous action. He was willing to break all the rules of diplomacy and neutrality to achieve a greater good. So why is this story not better known? Why does the image of the silent, passive pontiff persist? Perhaps because the plot failed. History is written by the victors, and it has little time for noble failures. Had the plot succeeded, Pius XII might be remembered today not as Hitler's Pope, but as the Pope who helped save the world. The failure of the general's plot marked a turning point. The Pope seems to have concluded that secret intervention was futile. He retreated back into his shell of public neutrality and quiet diplomacy, the posture he would maintain for the rest of the war, even as the Holocaust reached its most hellish intensity. The brief, tantalizing glimpse of a different kind of Pope, an activist Pope, vanished. The memory of his courageous gamble was buried, and the stage was set for the post-war battle that would come to define his pontificate, a bitter, decades-long war over his legacy, a war that would turn the process of his own sainthood into a battleground for the soul of history. When the guns of the Second World War fell silent, a new kind of war began, a war for memory. For decades, the dominant narrative of Pope Pius XII was that of a saintly, impartial figure, a spiritual father who had guided the Church through its darkest hour. He was praised for his efforts to make Rome an open city, for his charitable works, and for his staunch opposition to communism. He was seen as a man of peace who had done all he could in an impossible situation. But in the 1960s, this narrative was shattered by a play, Rolf Hochhuth's The Deputy, which depicted the Pope as a cold, cynical politician who was silent about the Holocaust out of political calculation and a callous disregard for Jewish lives. This was the opening shot in a historical war that continues to this day, a war that has transformed the Vatican's campaign to make Pius a saint into one of the most contentious debates in modern history. The term Hitler's Pope entered the public lexicon in 1999 with the publication of a book of that title by British author John Cornwell. Drawing on new, though limited, access to Vatican archives, Cornwell painted a devastating portrait of Eugenio Pacelli as an ambitious anti-Semitic careerist who, from his early days as a diplomat, was obsessed with consolidating papal power. The Reichskonkordat, Cornwell argued, was not a defensive measure but a cynical deal to destroy Catholic political opposition in Germany in exchange for a treaty that enhanced the Vatican's prestige. His silence during the Holocaust, according to this view, was the logical culmination of a lifetime of prioritizing institutional power over human compassion. The book was a sensation, and it solidified the image of Pius XII as the great moral failure of the 20th century. The Vatican and its defenders responded with a furious counter-offensive. They branded Cornwell and other revisionist historians as anti-Catholic polemicists who were twisting the evidence to fit a preconceived narrative. They began to publish their own mountain of books and articles, portraying the Pope as a heroic, misunderstood figure. In their telling, Pius XII was a master diplomat who understood that public denunciations would be suicidal. His silence was not a sign of indifference, but a carefully considered strategy to allow the Church to carry out its vast, secret rescue mission. They pointed to the thousands of Jews hidden in monasteries and convents as proof of his true intentions. They highlighted the testimonials of Jewish survivors who praised the Pope for his help. They argued that he was not Hitler's Pope, but Hitler's greatest and most effective enemy. The debate became a kind of historical courtroom drama, with historians acting as prosecutors and defense attorneys. The prosecution presented the evidence of his public silence, the failure to ever name the Nazis or the Jews, the refusal to excommunicate collaborating politicians like Monsignor Tizot, the focus on diplomatic niceties while a continent burned. They pointed to his pre-war and post-war actions, the Concordat, the ratlines, as evidence of a consistent pattern of prioritizing institutional advantage over moral clarity. They argued that the secret rescue work, while laudable, was carried out by brave individuals on the ground and cannot be directly attributed to the Pope's leadership. It would have happened, they suggest, with or without him. The defense countered with evidence of the Pope's private actions. They produced documents showing his instructions to his nuncios to intervene on behalf of Jews. They cited his Christmas addresses as clear, if coded, condemnations of the genocide. They presented the staggering numbers, estimates range up to 800,000 of Jews saved by the Church, arguing that such a widespread effort could only have happened with the Pope's tacit approval and encouragement. They portrayed him as a man trapped, making the best possible choices in an impossible situation, a shepherd protecting his entire flock from a ravenous wolf, even if it meant some were lost. He was, in their view, a secret saint, a man whose prudence was a form of martyrdom. This historical battle reached its peak when the Vatican began the formal process of beatification for Pius XII, the last step before sainthood. For the Catholic Church, making a person a saint is an internal matter, a declaration that a person is in heaven and worthy of veneration. But in the case of Pius XII, it became an international incident. Jewish organizations, survivor groups, and many historians protested vehemently. They argued that to make this Pope a saint would be a grave insult to the memory of the 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust. It would be a validation of his policy of silence, and an endorsement of the idea that institutional self-preservation is a higher value than the defense of human life. The beatification process, which is usually a quiet scholarly affair, became a public relations war. The controversy has created a deep rift, not just between Catholics and Jews, but within the Catholic Church itself. Progressive Catholics tend to agree with the critics, seeing the case of Pius XII as a symbol of the Church's past sins of authoritarianism and political compromise. Conservative Catholics rally to his defense, viewing him as a hero who is being unfairly maligned by the secular enemies of the Church. The battle for the legacy of Pius XII has become a proxy war for the future direction of the Catholic Church. Is it an institution that should be a bold prophetic voice, speaking truth to power no matter the cost? Or is it a pragmatic political institution that must sometimes make difficult compromises to survive and carry out its mission in a fallen world? For decades, this debate was stuck in a stalemate. Both sides were arguing from the same limited set of published documents, interpreting them in radically different ways. The full story, everyone agreed, was locked away in the Vatican's secret archives in the millions of pages of documents from the pontificate of Pius XII. The Vatican kept them sealed, citing the immense task of cataloguing them. But for critics, this was just an excuse, a way to hide the damning evidence. The archives became the great unknown, the final repository of truth. For decades, historians pleaded for access. Then, in March of 2020, the moment finally came. Pope Francis ordered the seals to be broken. The doors to the archives swung open, and the world prepared, at last, to learn the final secrets of Hitler's Pope. The air in the Vatican Apostolic Archives is cool and dry, filled with the scent of aging paper and history itself. In March of 2020, that quiet atmosphere was charged with an electric sense of anticipation. After decades of waiting, historians from around the world were finally allowed access to the complete archives of the pontificate of Pope Pius XII. Millions of documents, previously locked away, were now open for inspection. The hope was that these papers would finally provide a definitive answer to the question that had haunted the 20th century. Was Pius XII a saint or a sinner? A silent savior or a willing accomplice? The world expected a verdict. What it got was something far more complex and unsettling. The initial wave of researchers who descended on the archives were like prospectors in a gold rush. They worked with feverish intensity, sifting through mountains of diplomatic cables, internal memos, transcripts of meetings, and thousands of desperate handwritten letters from ordinary people across war-torn Europe. The first discoveries to emerge were explosive, and they did not paint a flattering picture of the Holy See. Researchers found direct, desperate pleas from Jewish groups sent to the Pope himself, begging for a public condemnation of the massacres. One letter from 1942 contained a detailed 5-page report on the mass murder of Jews in Warsaw and the Lvov ghetto, explicitly mentioning the use of gas. The letter was received, filed, and apparently ignored. No public statement was made. Another set of documents revealed the internal discussions within the Vatican Secretariat of State. Memos showed that some of Pius's top advisors were counseling him against believing the reports of atrocities, dismissing them as Allied propaganda or Jewish exaggerations. There was a palpable atmosphere of old-school anti-Jewish prejudice, a sense that the Jewish people were prone to complaining and could not be trusted. One memo, written by a future cardinal, argued against an American request to condemn the Nazi atrocities, reasoning that if the Pope condemned the Nazis, he would also have to condemn the Bolsheviks, a move that would upset the Allies. It was a stunning display of cold diplomatic calculation, weighing political consequences while a genocide was underway. The moral imperative was lost in a fog of realpolitik. But the archives are not a one-sided story. Other researchers uncovered troves of documents that support the defenders of Pius XII. They found evidence of extensive behind-the-scenes efforts to save specific groups of Jews. They found records of papal funds being secretly funneled to rescue organizations. They discovered instructions from the Pope to his nuncios to issue false papers and to hide refugees. The picture that emerges is one of a deeply conflicted and compartmentalized policy. Publicly, the Vatican was obsessed with neutrality and diplomacy. Privately, and often chaotically, it was engaged in a significant humanitarian effort. The archives do not reveal a monstrous anti-Semite. They reveal a cautious, overwhelmed bureaucrat, a diplomat trying to use the tools of diplomacy in a situation that was not a diplomatic problem, but a moral apocalypse. Perhaps the most human and heartbreaking documents are the letters from ordinary Jews addressed directly to His Holiness Pope Pius XII. They are filled with a desperate, almost naive faith that this great moral leader could and would save them. A family from Slovakia writes, asking for help to avoid deportation. A man in Poland describes the horrors of the ghetto and begs the Pope to speak out. These letters were read, they were annotated by the Pope's staff, and then for the most part, nothing was done. The archives reveal not a villain, but a tragedy of institutional paralysis. The Vatican was a machine designed for deliberation, for careful study, for diplomacy. It was faced with a crisis that demanded immediate, passionate, and unambiguous action. The machine simply could not respond. It continued to do what it was designed to do. It wrote memos, it filed reports, and it maintained its silence. The opening of the archives, therefore, has not ended the debate. It has only made it deeper and more painful. It has stripped away the simple, competing myths of the saintly savior and the evil collaborator. In their place is a far more troubling reality, a story of a flawed human being leading a flawed human institution, failing to rise to an unprecedented moral challenge. The archives show that the Pope knew far more, far earlier, than was previously understood. He knew the details of the Holocaust and he chose not to speak. His defenders can point to the thousands he saved through quiet action. His critics can point to the millions who might have been saved, or at least granted the dignity of being publicly mourned and defended had he used his powerful voice. So, we are left not with an answer, but with a series of eternal questions. What is the true nature of moral courage? Is it the quiet, practical work of saving a few, or the loud, prophetic witness that may save no one, but preserves the truth? Can a deal with the devil ever be justified if the survival of your faith is at stake? The story of the Vatican and the Third Reich is not a closed chapter of history. It is a living wound, a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of power, the seductive logic of pragmatism, and the terrifying price of silence. The rustle of those old papers in the Vatican archive is not the sound of history being settled. It is the sound of ghosts, still whispering, still waiting for a response. The final judgment on Pius XII will not be found in an archive. It can only be found in the conscience of every person who confronts his story and asks themselves the most difficult question of all: what would I have done?